Dear eminent speakers, guests and participants, Namaste and good evening. Welcome to the first BIMSTEC dialogue series organized by Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement. At the first BIMSTEC dialogue series, we are focusing on the Sri Lanka crisis. To speak at this special session on Sri Lankan crisis today, we have Dr. Sambhuram Simkhada, former Nepalese diplomat and professor, and George Cook, initiator of Aware Log Initiative and former Sri Lankan diplomat. The program will be moderated by Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt, member of the Parliament of Nepal and security expert. Before we formally hand over the floor to the chair, I am delighted to invite Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, Director of NICE Nepal, to deliver welcome remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Distinguished speakers, chair, eminent speakers, eminent scholars, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all at the first BIMSTEC dialogue series on the current Sri Lankan crisis. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is educated. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Defense and Security Studies. We also focus on 8 major research topics: global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, climate change and energy, disaster management, international economy and development, China's Belt and Road Initiative, Indo-Pacific affairs, refugee and migration, transboundary and water politics. Journal for Security and International Studies is NICE's flagship peer-reviewed journal. It also publishes newsletter, research papers, commentaries, monographs, and books regularly. In the last 2 years, we have published around 500 articles, hosted around 1,500 scholars through 120 events. NICE has hosted some of the prominent scholars like Noam Chomsky, Mir Simon, Stephen Walt, former Deputy State Minister of Education of Maldives, former Minister of New Zealand, Nepalese ministers, and renowned scholars from around the world and the region. At the time when Sri Lanka is in crisis, we thought to have the first BIMSTEC dialogue on the Sri Lankan crisis. We are privileged to join by Ambassador Dr. Sambhuram Simkhada and George Cook at today's discussion. Today, maybe the speaker may focus on some of the following permanent questions. 1. The current political and economic situation of Sri Lanka. What led to the crisis? What is the role of regional power like India and China? What could be the way out? Means how can Sri Lanka overcome this crisis? There are also lots of comparison between Nepal and Sri Lanka. So it is Nepal. There are lots of questions that is Nepal a new Sri Lanka, or is it the Sri Lanka in making? There are also we would like to highlight that are there any lessons for Nepal and the regional countries that we can learn from the Sri Lankan experience? These are only some of the questions that came to my mind, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions from the learned audience. I once again would like to welcome all our guests, speakers, and participants, and wish you all wonderful deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. Now I request the chair, moderator of the event, Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt, to initiate the discussion. Let me introduce first Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt. Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt is an elected member of the House Representative at the Federal Parliament of Nepal. He is also a member of the International Affairs Committee of the Federal Parliament of Nepal. Dr. Bhatt holds Ph.D. from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Previously, he served as a member of the high-level task force on reorienting Nepal's foreign policy, headed by Minister for Foreign Affairs, and as a member of the Technical Committee and Secretariat for Supervision, Integration and Rehabilitation of Maoist Army Combatants. He is a visiting faculty at Tribhuvan University, Nepal Army Higher Command and Management Course, Army Command and Staff College, Institute of Crisis Management Studies, and APF Command and Staff College of Nepal. He has also participated at the DKI Asia Pacific Center for Strategic Studies, Hawaii, a study of United States Institutes on Foreign Policy, HMG Security and Justice course at the University of Birmingham, and advanced level course on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration course of transition, international, the Netherlands. Now, over to you, Dr. Bhatt.
Thank you. NICE team, Nepal Institute for International Engagement and Cooperation. NICE is a newly established think tank just before this pandemic, and during this whole period, as we are here, in a way, it's a new normal, and now in the last couple of weeks we can see that we are meeting in person, even thrice in a day in programs as usual. It happens. It was in Kathmandu, so it was lively. Now, during the pandemic, was recently the founding director, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, said about the NICE activities. They have massive activities, mostly the online webinars and the programs, and he has read in publication also. They have massive, so which is a big contribution to the international relations or the foreign policy component of the international relations, and of course the security and the strategic affairs also. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal and his team. And in fact, while establishing this organization, he was in consultation with me also, likewise with others, and he was planning to run this dialogue, the BIMSTEC dialogue series, and he put on hold as he was conceiving this idea in person. But it's good that he's back with this idea, and for the first time we are talking about Sri Lanka in Kathmandu, where we are hearing a scholar, former diplomat, and he will talk about what is the crisis, the real crisis, because we have seen many articles, many TV shows and talk programs and references while talking about the budget of this fiscal year in the parliament also. So we are referring just to Sri Lanka case. And in Sri Lanka's modern history, after 1940, when Sri Lanka got independence, then onwards, this is the first big crisis, or somewhere we can recall Why Nations Fail book, just recalling it, why nations fails or why nation got fractured, or somewhere in this big economic crisis it has entered. After 2019, though it has faced a big crisis of the conflict for decades, and as it was resolved, and after that how it has managed its international policies, domestic policies and the foreign policy, or in total the international affairs. So the reflection will be there by George, so I'm not going to say anything about the Sri Lankan crisis because it has many faces, it's multifaceted. So here, what I will do, I will give 25 minutes to George's group first, and then Dr. Simkhala. While George, briefly I'm reading his bio. George is a diplomatic historian whose main area of research includes foreign policy, diplomacy, regionalism and integration. He is a senior lecturer, Department of International Relations, University of Colombo, visiting lecturer at the National Defence College of Sri Lanka, Bandaranaike International Diplomatic Training Institute, Defence Services Command and Staff College, and Sri Lanka Air Force Academy, among others. He founded Aware Law Initiative, Sri Lanka's first virtual platform to enhance awareness and dialogue in international relations. He is the host of the Sri Lanka Understanding in High TV, a weekly program that covers the past, present, and the potentials of the country, Sri Lanka, and he is frequent contributor to the international media. Possessing a doctorate in international relations from University of Colombo, he is alumnus of the Netherlands Institute of International Relations, The Hague, and the visiting fellow of an Yvonne Rastani University, Thailand. A former Sri Lankan diplomat, he has a decade-long career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As personal assistant to the Sri Lankan foreign minister and to the Sri Lankan foreign minister from 2007 to 9, and the regional desk of East Asia and the Pacific, as well as the public communications desk. Overseas, he was stationed in the embassy of Sri Lanka in Paris and permanent delegation to the Sri Lanka to the UNESCO. So with this bio, I will hand over to the George to hear about Sri Lankan crisis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, for that very generous introduction. Namaste, and I'm very delighted to be in a country with which we have heard about, which we have dealt with from Sri Lanka, which has had historic connectivity with Sri Lanka, but a country at which I am coming for the first time. Better late than never, and I'm really happy to be here. I am in Nepal at the invitation of News Society Nepal, which organized a wide-ranging program culminating in panel discussion today, which focused on certain aspects of the Sri Lankan experience. What Sri Lanka has done, how Sri Lanka has progressed, looking at it from a BRI perspective, and what exactly is going on in Sri Lanka, what can Nepal learn from the Sri Lankan experience. So I really have to thank Deepak for the chairperson of News Society Nepal for inviting me to your amazing country and being able to be here. And I would also like to make special mention of Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, who upon hearing of my visit to Sri Lanka, to Nepal, made arrangements for us to meet here today. So thank you once again, and we are very honored to be sharing a panel with two distinguished personalities who have made a huge contribution in their respective fields and are very amenable to the whole idea of coming together today, understanding the Sri Lankan experience and focusing on what Sri Lanka has gone through, what Sri Lanka is going through, and how we are going to see things unfolding in the years ahead. I thought of sharing some thoughts with you on the whole process of understanding where Sri Lanka is in 2022 in terms of negotiating ground realities and navigating geopolitics. It's a two-dimensional approach. Sri Lanka has got to deal with two very critical issues at this point. And we can argue that all countries are doing this all the time. But we've come to a situation in which it has become that much more acute. It is not the normal running of a government. It is not the normal carrying on with day-to-day affairs in Sri Lanka at this very moment. How did Sri Lanka come to this? Why has Sri Lanka come into this situation? Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, speaking many decades ago, idolized Sri Lanka in wanting to make Singapore like Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has gone from a country which people wanted to be like to a country that nobody wants to be like. What has happened? Where have we gone wrong? Why has this unfolded? What lessons can we learn? There are certain lessons that other countries can learn, but there are very important lessons that Sri Lanka can learn. And that is something that we've got to deal with in terms of navigating ground realities. You are aware the international media is talking about the queues in the country, the shortages that are taking place. There are massive food shortages that are expected in the months ahead. Let's go back a few years. Let's go back to 2009. The world was talking about the defeat of terror. Terrorism reigned in many parts of the island, especially in the north and east of the country. Of course, there were bomb attacks in other parts of the island as well. There was a great degree of instability around the island. In 2009, we saw a defeat of terror, a defeat of terrorism, terror tactics. We thought we were ushering in a new era. We thought this was going to be change. Because if we reflect on the past, Sri Lanka was a country that was on a very progressive trajectory. If you go back to the 40s, at the time of independence in 1948, Sri Lanka was seen as a model colony of the United Kingdom when independence was being granted. Indices were very positive. Developments extremely progressive. The country went on to elect the world's first woman prime minister. Democracy was in full swing. 1931, we introduced, or rather the British introduced, universal franchise, giving us the ability to vote. All Sri Lankans above a certain age, irrespective of gender. Sri Lanka hence is identified as the oldest democracy in this part of the world. Where did things go wrong? And there are several aspects that we can look at. Was it the typical divide and rule policy that the British left us with? Was it the language policy of 1956? Was it the instability that was brought about by politicians in their endeavor to gain votes, playing one community against another? Are these all factors that contributed? In 1967, Sri Lanka was toying with the idea of joining a new group, a new association that was being created, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Out of the 5 who signed the original Bangkok Declaration, some were very much for it and some were a bit hesitant. But they said, let's wait for Ceylon's application to come in. You don't get automatic membership in international grouping. But our application did not go. For whatever reason, we did not apply. 10 years later, a new government comes in which talks about liberalizing the economy, opening up trade for the country. A new constitution is promulgated at that point and brought into operation. We try then to join ASEAN. But ASEAN does not want us by then. They don't give us a direct reason for that. Geography is a word that is thrown about. The island never moved anywhere from 67 to 77. We remained where we were. Was it policies of the 70s that also contributed? Look to the 80s. You come to the early 1980s, and you have a very tough relationship between the leadership in Sri Lanka and India. We have Indira Gandhi and Jayawardeneh who do not get along with each other. Various domestic developments have taken place in Sri Lanka. The world's first woman prime minister was deprived of her civic rights in 1980. That is what the Jayawardeneh government mooted and got done. Indira Gandhi was very unhappy about it. Sri Lanka and India went from 2 countries which were extremely close to each other to countries which drifted apart. Sri Lanka became extremely pro-American, earning the anger of personalities like Mrs. Gandhi at that point. You had the establishment of training camps of the LTT in India. The relationship goes sour. You come to July 83. We have the darkest moment in our history. The massacres that took place, the outpouring of refugees from the country, these all collectively had a very negative impact on the island. But the island was able to make progress. Terror now was entrenched, but development was taking place. Quite unusual to have it happening simultaneously, but how else do you do it? You can't wait for terror to end for development to start. We tried to do it side by side. We couldn't make the exact progress that we wanted to. There's a lot more that we could have done, but we couldn't. The conflict changed the trajectory of the island of Sri Lanka. Thereafter, we came to 2009 and we thought things were going to now change. We had massive economic development taking place. All people, all countries want progress. We don't sit back and think, let's do it gradually. 40 years from now, we will have some degree of progress. No one wants that. We're living in an era of instant noodles and instant coffee. We want things instantly. We want things as quickly as possible. Maybe it's too hurried. Maybe those are some of the lessons that we have to learn from the past. But when we look at what has transpired in the last decade, in the last 5 years, specifically in the last 3 years, from 2019 onwards, policy decisions that were taken were ill-advised and resulted in total mismanagement of very vital sectors of the economy. I'll just point to a few. We decided to do away with taxes of certain categories. Very attractive for taxpayers. Not very attractive when it comes to looking at the income of an island, of a country, of the government, and of the day. We also have a policy of banning chemical fertilizers. Wonderful. Personally, I think it's a great thing. Let's go green. Let's focus on chemical-free food. Sri Lanka was trying to promote the idea of the first country in the world to have banned chemical fertilizer. But anyone, you don't have to be an agriculturalist, you don't have to be a farmer, you don't have to be a policy maker to understand that you can't do it overnight. It's just not possible. It has to be strategized, it has to be planned, it has to be phased out and done gradually. All stakeholders have to be a part and parcel of the process. That did not happen. This was a big blunder, which has been admitted too. And now measures are being taken to rectify it. But there have been shortages in the production of rice, the effect of which is going to be felt in the months ahead. So we're trying now to ensure that we import enough. It's not that all along our rice production was sufficient for the island. Importation has taken place throughout the period of post-independence. But that was another big blunder that was made. Sri Lanka is a developing country. Developing countries need assistance. You need financial infusions. It is a rather sensitive topic, or it was made a sensitive topic, about approaching the International Monetary Fund, international financial institutions. By the way, the largest amount of debt that Sri Lanka owes is through sovereign bonds out there. We owe a lot more to international financial institutions. We owe much less to China and Japan. It's on par. It's roughly 10% of our debt. But of course, what gets highlighted is not the debt that we owe the international financial institutions or the sovereign bonds that have been sold. It is instead the debt that we owe one particular country. So various developments in the last few years, couple of years. COVID on one side, but COVID hit all of us around the world. COVID brought about a reduction in tourism, reduction to virtual zero levels. An economy that is reliant on migrant workers' remittances, that is reliant on tourism, is now having migrant workers being sent back home because of conditions of health in their own countries that they've been gone to work in. Plus you have tourism being affected. Sri Lanka is losing out massively when it comes to income. How do we overcome this? Do we take immediate measures of reaching out to the IMF, World Bank, ADB, AIIB, whatever the institution may be out there? No. Certain people felt, no, we need to find homegrown solutions, indigenous ways of doing things. You can do that if you are in a strong position economically and financially. You cannot do that when you are in a very vulnerable, insecure position. Sadly, that is what transpired in Sri Lanka. We have now come to a point in which we have a shortage of foreign currency, a foreign exchange crisis. Hence, we are unable to buy as much fuel as we would like. Ships are calling at the port of Colombo. There is no credit limit, there is no credit time. They don't say you can pay us within 2 weeks or 1 week. They want the money up front or the ship will sail away. Because there are other ports waiting to buy the fuel. A shortage of fuel is leading to a shortage in power. Why? Because we have had the electrification of the country being based very largely on fuel, which is something that we've been trying to change. Consecutive leaders, including the current president, talked about it. But there are various mafias that do not like to see renewable energy. Sri Lanka is very hot. We have the sun, I could argue, about 340 days of the year. We can go solar. We are an island. We are surrounded by the oceans. There's wave energy. There's wind energy. The list is endless. There are countries like the Netherlands which have a very brief opening of beach, which have put out so many different forms to harness energy. Windmills, so many different formats are being used, structures are being used. But certain people are more concerned about the commissions that they earn. And this is a time that we are calling all of this into question. This is a time in which politicians and policy makers have failed. This is also a time when public servants have failed. This is also a time when the people have failed. We have failed to understand that leaders have to be held accountable for what they do. Many are now gradually slipping away. Resignations are taking place. They are stepping down. It is being hailed. People say, wow, the people's struggle has brought about this resignation and that resignation. But what's the next step? They're just going to get on the next plane and go to their other homes elsewhere in the world, while the people of Sri Lanka, who are not dual citizens, who do not have citizenship anywhere else in the world, are going to suffer as a result of the actions that have been taken by a few people who were entrusted with the task of leading the country. The position of leadership is not ownership. You are a guardian. You are asked to safeguard the country. They failed, and they failed miserably. If we go on to the international level and some of the developments taking place in the current context, I would like to first reflect on India. If not for the economic assistance and the financial lines that are being extended out to New Delhi, Sri Lanka would have been in a much worse situation than we are already. Minister Jaishankar was in Sri Lanka just a few months ago. He visited a queue, a petrol queue. No Sri Lankan minister would dare to go near a petrol queue. Wouldn't dare to go near a petrol queue. They are not in the queues either. Where they get their fuel from, who knows? Maybe their vehicles are electric. But they do not dare to join a queue. We saw 1 month ago riots breaking out. Thankfully, it was contained. This is being broadcast around the world. Sri Lanka went through decades of conflict and we had a negative image out there due to terror. Now we have more problems being brought about due to poor decision making by our own leaders. Due to the assistance that is coming, that is continuing to come from countries like India, we are seeing a continuation of the economy. But we must remember one thing: India can't keep giving and giving and giving. There comes to a point where India also has to stop and ask, how are we going to manage? We also have poverty-stricken areas in our own country. We can't just keep your country afloat and let our country go down. But India is very concerned at this point that if Sri Lanka slips further, you're going to have boatloads of people crossing the Box Strait into India. India does not want another 83 and another mass exodus of refugees into that country. India is very concerned about the situation we are in right now. How about countries elsewhere? How about countries in the West? One thing that we have noticed when it comes to foreign policy towards Sri Lanka from certain countries out there, certain countries are looking at personalities in power. Certain countries are looking at the position of Sri Lanka. One country in particular does not care who is in power, they will work with us because of our position. There's another country out there which is very interested in who is in power. If it is a certain personality from a certain family, nope, there's no assistance coming. If it's another individual, okay, we'll consider assistance. They are taking their own cool time. Sri Lanka is slipping further and further into crisis. The current Prime Minister, upon being sworn into office, said, "I will assure you 3 meals a day." This is a country which has a tradition, a cultural tradition of 2,500 years. We are not a country that was created yesterday. And you have a leader coming into power saying, the basic thing I can give you is 3 meals a day. Last week, the newspaper headlines, the first thing I saw as I woke up in the morning was, the Prime Minister promises 2 meals a day. I'm very worried of the weeks ahead. I don't want to wake up one morning to read a headline saying 1 meal a day, and the next thing is going to be now starve. Or rather, there won't be a newspaper. We don't want to fall into that situation. Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans don't deserve this. Those who have put the country into this situation have to be held accountable. The former Prime Minister has the audacity yesterday in Parliament of saying the people who are engaging in peaceful protests have blood on their hands. What a mockery of that statement. They reacted to an action he took. He set mobs on peaceful protesters. Those protesters did not retaliate, but people around the country went to ruling party members' houses and burnt them, damaged them, because they were so angry. Now the main priority in Parliament, unfortunately, has been compensation for the ministers and members of Parliament, for the houses that they have lost. But now the question is being asked, how did they construct those houses with the salaries that they receive? Have they declared these in their assets and liabilities declaration? If so, let's compensate them. If they haven't, it's ill-gotten wealth which is now gone. This is where Sri Lankans are now awakening, and this is where there is a national awakening to what is going on. The current position taken by countries like India have been further emboldened with a statement that came out of the Chinese Foreign Ministry just 2 days ago. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said, India has done a lot. We are willing to work with India to support Sri Lanka. Deepak coined a very interesting term a day before, and he used the term crisis diplomacy. This is exactly what is unfolding right now in Sri Lanka. Countries are coming together, countries which you wouldn't expect to be working together in times of crisis. Sri Lanka is not accusing any country of not supporting it. Countries are giving what they can give. They're doing what they can. They all have their own troubles, their own problems, their own issues to deal with. Sri Lankan leaders have messed up that country. You can't expect others to clean up the mess. We've got to gradually clean up the mess ourselves within the country. And that's what we're trying to do right now. Hopefully, in the months ahead, hopefully next year by this time, things are going to be different. But I keep using the word hopefully, because we need radical change in the country. We need change for the better, change which is going to see people being put first, but most importantly, the country being put first. Not commissions, not bribes, not corruption. Those are some of the lessons that we have learned in Sri Lanka. And we do not want to see a repetition of that in our country ever again. And that is what we are striving very hard to do. So those are some of the thoughts I would like to share with you. More than willing to take up any questions you might have later on or respond to them. I'm waiting to listen to Ambassador as well. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, George Cook. Excellent presentation and how the ongoing crisis of Sri Lanka is unfolding and what are the key challenges or what are the factors behind this crisis, which is not just seen in the surface when we read in media or in social media. So it has a long history. There are many underpinnings or the undercurrent things, and at the same time he questioned and leave a message that how the guardians of the country, those who are responsible and those who are judging the changes or must be looking or must be dealing appropriately, the institutions or the policies. And without delaying and going into detail, a little bit knowledge what I have about Sri Lanka, I'm not going into that. But the situation we have seen, and I was referring the Why Nations Fail, a very famous book by Taryn Esmoglu and James Robinson. Many of or all of us had read that book or his articles, their articles, but the lessons drawn or the suggestions or the recommendations are not working. It's completely different. And internationally, what we see that how states are going fail, how states are going failed or fractured or something like that. It's completely different story. And we can have Q&A session briefly, and we can talk about lessons learned regarding the what death trap is, what the MCC case is in Sri Lanka case, and then what is the, I mean, though it was Easter bombings, and then as he was mentioning about the completely, you know, the forex reserves was, and monetary policy or central bank was haphazardly handling the money printing case, and many things are there, but it's excellent presentation. So now I would like to invite Dr. Samburam Simkara. We all know him, scholar, ambassador, Dr. Samburam Simkara, who served as a member of the Secretariat of the Special Committee, which was looking after the supervision, integration, and the rehabilitation of the Maoist army combatants. My colleague, we worked together in that committee, the technical committee and the Secretariat. This is my privilege. I'm introducing you here to the August audience. He was former permanent representative to the United Nations, the World Trade Organizations, and other international organizations in Geneva, and also served as the chairman of the United Nations Human Rights Commission Council, ambassador to the Switzerland, and member secretary and treasurer of the Social Welfare Council earlier. He teaches at the Department of the International Relations and Diplomacy, at the same time Department of the Conflict, Peace and Development Studies, and as well as other institutions. So, Dr. Simkara, forum is to you.
Mr. Chairman, it's always a pleasure to participate in forums chaired by a distinguished friend like you. George, Pramod, very distinguished friends in the audience. In fact, this may be a small gathering, but in terms of quality, my goodness, what a spectrum of power, both in terms of military power as well as brain power. So, great to be here. Pramod, thanks for the invitation. Well, I was planning to, get on to the Sri Lankan crisis only after making a little bit of a background as to the broader picture. But George, sort of his presentation, his brilliant presentation, made me feel that I must go right into it. And so I will skip the background ideas that I was going to make, except the fact that The first time I was in Sri Lanka was in 1981. Maybe some of you weren't even born, but I was traveling from Sri Lanka to Seychelles and then on to several countries in Africa. And that sort of made me realize why Lee Kuan Yew said what he said in the beginning when he set out to create Singapore as an independent sovereign country, seceding from the Malaysian peninsula. Since then, I've been to Sri Lanka several times. The last time was in conjunction with the recent BIMSTEC summit. There was a, what you call a BIMSTEC roundtable organized by a very well-known institute in India, a well-known institute in Sri Lanka, called the India Foundation and the Pathfinder Foundation. Because of the airline schedule, I arrived in Colombo 2 days before the actual program. So as a result, we went to visit a famous Sri Lankan site called Dambola Cave, where the Buddha's cave. And we traveled almost 370 kilometers. Different kinds of roads. The main highway, then smaller roads, and then roads passing through settlements. On the way back, of course, my mind was somewhere else. So as a result, after returning, Bindu, my wife, told me, "Did you notice something?" I said, "What?" We traveled 370 kilometers and not a single pothole on the road. So that sort of triggered my mind even more. This idea as to why a country like Sri Lanka is where it is today. And so the day we left, the curfew started. And as we returned here, this thing was going through my mind. And recently, I guess that was my qualification for Pramod, thinking of me to come and speak to you about this. In the sense that, is Nepal on the way? That question. So I have a piece in the Naya Patrika, wherein I have identified 4 basic issues. The first is, as I said, since the time I first went to Colombo in 1981, I must have visited Sri Lanka almost 7 or 8 times. And each of the successive times I visited there, I've seen a kind of a decline. As you know, at that time, I didn't even have a Ph.D. So soon after that 1981 visit, I went to the US for my Ph.D. and came back. And as soon as I came back, we started this idea called Regional Study Center at the Center for Nepal and Asian Studies. So before writing my recent article, I went back to the articles that were written by different scholars in the book called Sina's Air Review. And there was one particular chapter on Sri Lanka. And that proved my thesis that in fact Sri Lanka, what has happened now, did not start now. There's a lot of talk about the debt. In fact, I was looking at the article and it was said that Sri Lanka had 2.9 billion debt in 1986. So it's a build-up. what only happened is since that time, the decline has been more rapid. And the principal issue is the issue of governance. That, I think, is the number one issue as to why Sri Lanka is where it is today. Second, of course, is the major factor is, as George was referring, conflict. And during the time we were studying the regional developments in politics, economics, security, and foreign policy of this, at that time there were only 7 SAARC countries, China, Japan, then the 2 superpowers of the time, US and Soviet Union, and then what we call continental studies, Africa, Latin America, and so on. It was already there. You know, those articles in those books published in 1987, 86, 87, 88, the 3 years I was with SINAS. There were signals that in fact Sri Lanka is heading into trouble. What I find in similarity in terms of conflict is, you know, ultimately Sri Lanka had initially a kind of a more class conflict, the JVP, and then a regional conflict and ethnic conflict of the Tamils. And many of the scholars and leaders with whom I had the opportunity to interact at that time, people like Lalit Atulat Mudale, were killed during those conflicts. This long conflict had a tremendous impact on Sri Lanka. I see Dr. Vishnu Preti, in fact, talking about this in front of him is like lighting a candle in front of the sun. But nonetheless, one of the critical issues in conflict and conflict resolution is, you know, conflicts create problems for the people, but it also creates opportunities for the opportunists. And that, I think, is a real issue. Now, Sri Lanka and Nepal went to 2 different methods of conflict resolution. We went for a negotiated political settlement, whereas Sri Lanka went for a military suppression of the rebels. But what I find similar in both cases is that in Nepal, the rebel side were able to impose their agenda on all of the other political actors. And as a result, that gave them a kind of a victorious mood and a sense that they can do anything, get away with anything. So there was no accountability. There was absolute immunity for whatever you do. And in case of Sri Lanka, although they went for a different approach to conflict resolution, I think partly the same arrogance of power, that once we come to power, that we can impose whatever we want on the people. I think, and as a result, what happened is the process of transition, the change management. There's a famous saying of Samuel Huntington. He said, in any dynamic society, change is inevitable, but change does not necessarily bring progress. Change is inevitable, progress is not. Progress has to be brought by the people, by the leadership. And for that, you need effective change management. And that is where I think both sides, on one side, because of the military victory, the other side, because of the political sort of victory, gave them that arrogance. And so the change management problem, in my view, is the second most important The third is, of course, the overall economic and political management. And as I said, the decline started long time. It's the same thing in Nepal. There are many people who feel that many of the problems that we are facing today is because of the political change. Not so, my friends, not so. I've seen both sides. I've been in the old system. And the decline started long ago. I'll tell you a small story. I was, as I was introduced, I was in the first treasurer and then the member secretary of the Social Welfare Council. At that time it was called Social Services Coordination Committee. And my wife is a school teacher. So the government had given us a large, old, breakdown kind of Toyota Crown, big car. And my wife taught at a school in Samaguchi. The road from Social Welfare Council building to that school was very narrow. So I used to tell the driver, look, don't even horn, okay? Just if there are people, then wait for them. Because then they'll say, oh, the member secretary of the Social Welfare Council doing this and that. And once, to the driver, it was intolerable. There were a group of kids, young guys, holding hands and blocking the whole road for almost 100 meters and not leaving the road. So as a result, the driver horned. And you know what these people did? They just, instead of leaving the road, they just turned around, looked at me with red eyes, because I was sitting at the back of the car, with a government car, with a white plate, the big Toyota Crown, as if saying that you have gotten to that position at our cost. So I came and told the king and queen, saying Panchayat is going. So they were amazed. Why? And this is the story I told them. The feeling I'm getting from them is that to get to some place, generally you have to work hard, you have to be honest. There's a culture that you need. And that's the culture I grew up with. But no. People want everything. They want it right now, and they want it without working for it. And then they see that was somebody doing well. So that is the general environment in which we started entering. And that's nobody's fault. This whole transformation from the old system to what we call today the ITAs is that it has given us access to information on how everyone else is doing. But then how everyone else is doing is a process of a long history of hard work, long history of honesty, long history of discipline, long history of institution building, long history of a culture. We've forgotten that. So as a result, the point I'm making is the decline started long ago, but then what has happened is it has been accelerated. And as a result, we see today in Nepal, the movement of independence. People have lost faith in the system, lost faith in what you call the institution of government because of malgovernance. And that, I think, is partly the reason, the economic and political management. George very rightly pointed out that it's very fashionable to point out at the Chinese debt. You're right, in my article it's mentioned, that the Sri Lanka started having debt for a long time. Especially, there used to be a group of countries called the Asian Tigers. They were praised for the kind of prosperity and progress they made. But because of the East Asian financial crisis, I've written somewhere that these fierce tigers were turned into helpless rabbits. And how, in a very quickly, countries, because of internal mismanagement, misgovernance, as well as external environment in which we exist, can suddenly turn from good to bad. And that is the Sri Lankan case. That in fact, a country that we all thought, and even today, if you look at the basic social and economic indicators, Sri Lanka is among the top in the developing world. And yet such a country can get to this stage. So that's the economic and social and political management. But finally, something unique to many developing countries that I find is not often talked about is what we call the pyramid of national interest. You know, I often wonder, you know, in this seminar also, there were two very dear friends of mine. In fact, there are three very well-known Sri Lankan diplomats who I work with very closely. The first one is Bernard Gunatilake, who I'm sure you know. Bernard was with me in Geneva. Later on, from there, he went as foreign secretary. From there, he went as ambassador to China. And then from there, he became ambassador in US. The other one was, now Bernard is a Christian. Prasad Karyavasan, another very dear friend, again was my colleague. Then he came over and I don't know, he became foreign secretary, ambassador to the, no, from Geneva he went to New York as PR in New York, became foreign secretary, then became ambassador to India, and then eventually retired as ambassador to the US. So it was after a long time, it was a kind of a wonderful get together. And that is what triggered me to reflect on this idea that we, developing countries collectively, except big ones like the India and China, face a dilemma of this, what I call the pyramid of national interest, something which I've talked about in Nepal a long time, since a long time. What we have is what I call a reverse sequencing of national interest. Every country is supposed to use foreign policy or its national security policy as an instrument of power for the protection and promotion of national interest. But what happens is this national interest, the idea called national interest, is a composite of, first of all, individual interest. Everybody beautifully, Joseph, many people, as you put it, as the problem sinks, they take off. So first, every individual have their own interests. Number one. At the bottom of the pyramid is the individual interest. Now, a nation state is nothing but a collection of individuals revolving around certain set of institutions. Nice is an institution. Army is an institution. Police is an institution. Parliament is an institution. The Supreme Court is an institution. So there are, individuals are organized around these institutions. So each of these institutions also have their own interests. And when the leadership at the top fails to comprehend the idea that you need to assimilate all of these interests towards the broader national interest, then what happens is there is an incongruence. There is a disconnect between an individual's interest, the institutional interest, and national interest. And that way, in my view, Sri Lanka is not alone. In fact, Sri Lanka's decline, as we see now, did not start today. It had been building up for a long time. The second conclusion I have is Sri Lanka is not alone. Look at the tragedy. You have Russia and Ukraine fighting. There is war in Ukraine. countries with 60 to 70% of the population dependent on agriculture are facing starvation. What does that tell you? That tells you that there is a fundamental problem with the development paradigm on which we are working. And as a result, if we don't comprehend this structural dilemma that we have, all of our policies, where do they come from? When the World Bank says this, you do this. One time the World Bank says privatization, no, divest public sector. So you sell all your public institutions. No, government's role is not to get involved in productive sector. It's only then suddenly after a decade or two, World Bank comes back and no, the role of the government is important. So the problem we have is we have fundamentally a different set of interests. And especially because of globalization and now deglobalization, at one end you have what you call globalization of economics, globalization of technology, physical movement of people, goods and services. And yet at the core of what you call national interest, each country is for itself or for itself. And as a result, developing countries that depend so much, both not just in physical economic terms, but in fact in outsourcing our process of governance, sooner or later, that's the direction we are all going. So my understanding, and after reflecting, and this is proven by many things. I was at one time involved in a study of why do countries fail in the Geneva Center for Security Policies. And there were a group of 5 scholars, one Norwegian, one American, one South African, and one American and myself. So as we continued on this study, I came to the conclusion that ultimately what determines a country's success or failure is essentially the role of leadership in governance. It's not physical resources. Otherwise, why would Singapore, that started by thinking Sri Lanka as a model, is where it is today, and Sri Lanka in this situation? So when I came to that conclusion, and I came also to the conclusion that this is an issue that the national leadership, or in fact the regional leadership, must recognize and act on it. You can't depend, there is such a thing called, when it comes to national interest, not even your best friends can be your champions. And that is the model of state behavior that we are in today. On one side, you have globalization of other things, but on the other side, on politics and security, you are for yourself. And COVID has proven it, and the Sri Lankan case partly is a reflection of this new geopolitics, the interplay of those factors that, unless we realize, is difficult to address. And let me conclude by saying, this is a BIMSTEC dialogue. So my consistent approach since my first paper on SARC in 1987, when I was still with TU, SINAS. By the way, my next book is going to be on SARC to BIMSTEC, breakdown or breakthrough. Is it a process to create a breakthrough, or is it going to be a breakdown? SARC is almost in a breakdown, it's in a coma. So is the idea of creating a new institution called BIMSTEC by including parts of SARC countries and parts of ASEAN countries, is it going to be a breakthrough? And that breakthrough will depend on a few fundamentals. And those fundamentals is what I'm talking about. One is regional cooperation or integration for national transformation, which means we must transform within ourselves, but that transformation can happen by cooperation within the region. And that is what we have seen in Sri Lanka. That, in fact, you're absolutely right. India has come to your rescue up to a point, but then there is a limit to how much they can go. So there has to be a synchronization between regional cooperation, because after all, the problem with South Asia is we have always been outward looking. Our trade is outside, our intellectual outlook is outside, our technology is from outside, and as a result, at one stage, there has to be a synchronization of our internal transformation with regional integration. And that way, I think, when young men like Jaws have woken up to this idea that, in fact, unless we address this pyramid, that collectively we must first, especially at times of crisis, make national interest our main goal. In normal times, individual interest, institutional interest, national interest. Crisis time, individual interest, institutional interest, national interest comes first. Once you can do that, once you can bring about that transformation, then of course with the kind of educational background that you have, with the kind of intellectual background that you have in Sri Lanka, and of course the good infrastructure that you have, I think you will come over that crisis. We are very much with you, and in any way, obviously an institution like ours can only do it intellectually, but then there'll be others who come and express solidarity, stand shoulder to shoulder with Sri Lanka and the people of Sri Lanka. And soon, Sri Lanka will come out of this crisis, and we have our best wishes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Simkara. You have rightly pointed out the problems the Sri Lankan society has faced, the polity has faced. It's to some extent, yes, it's triology or the trifold conflict which waged for decades, and then the masters, or especially the leaders, when dealing with the policies or the framing policies and implementing them, the honesty and the loyalty with the institutions and all these things. And as you were mentioning, Huntington, and rightly, pointing on how the progressive can be brought. So thank you again. And with this, we have about 30 minutes or 20 minutes for Q&A session. So without delaying, I will open floor and just introduce yourself and affiliation, 2 things, and then be brief for your question or query so that we can utilize the time. Yes, please, Dr. Casey.
So, will you give microphone or Alicia? I don't think. I'll try my best to use this energy. Chair of the session and all distinguished speakers. So I have straight questions to Dr. observers. This is Casey, I teach at the university. Well, I think many things you have shared with us, and I heard you spoke at my department yesterday, and I was not around because of my prior commitment. I wish I could come. So things like in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka has become kind of like a role model for South Asian, all South Asian countries, especially in the SDI index. You are quite ahead than the rest of all the South Asian countries. Probably Bhutan is doing well, however, compared to like none other than Bhutan, Sri Lanka is still ahead. And we have been cited quite often as part like the economy has trained Sri Lanka, Singapore, like Sri Lanka. So my question is, in the recent years, in 2018, I invited Admiral Jawaharlal when I was organizing a BRI conference, and so I just wanted to make sure whether Sri Lanka, the narratives created by the Western and even the Indian scholars that Sri Lanka is one of the role model of their track. So that to expose the ground reality, I invited Admiral Jawaharlal, who was the recent immediate past foreign secretary of Sri Lanka as well. So he has shared a very incisive paper among us, and he counter-argued. So Sri Lanka has just around 10% loan of China compared to the rest of others from World Bank and IMF and Western world. So it's not like a story what was been created by the Western scholars that Sri Lankan trade is only because of China. So now situation out of blue came up, and people have smelled something wrapped on the same discourses, same argument, same narratives created by all the South Asian and Western scholars. So what I'm trying to know from your part, being a scholars, and in the meantime you had a diplomatic experiences as well. What is the ground reality behind, whether because of the Dr. Sinkara has noted that because of the leadership, even compared to all the South Asian leadership, Sri Lanka has very mature intellectual history, very long intellectual history, either because of colonial legacy or only because of its own 2,500 years long history. So intellectual history from points of view also, the leadership of Sri Lanka is still not much behind compared to other South Asian countries. She produced the first lady prime minister. So whether the leadership failure, whether it's because of regime, whether because of recent past oligarchy, I cannot take the name of some family rule of Sri Lanka, couple of years in between after the post-conflict, whether haphazard engagement, borrowing of foreign aid and loan for post-conflict reconstruction, or so-called Hemantota scam made Sri Lanka in this stage. So could you please categorically enlighten us what is the reason behind Sri Lanka having this situation, especially in the economic development? That's my point.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Nina Vidyama.
Namaste. First of all, I would like to thank NISC for making me the part of the very short and specific program. Both the presenters have presented papers in a very comprehensive, analytical way, and it is more comparative because they both of them have talked on what Sri Lanka used to be and how Sri Lanka is suffering in the present days. We know Sri Lanka is going, I think, through the darkest moment in their historical period, and we think this is the most tragic moments they are passing through in terms of the lowest human security situations. That is why we see declining and deteriorating Sri Lanka every passing moments and days. And most of the problems they have suffered, they have acute the problem to their malgovernance, as explained by Sinkara, the weak leadership, and the book is much talked about that why do nations fail. In that field, I think James Robinson has described, I want to share a few lines. The poor nations are poorer and poorer, not because of their geography and culture, but because the leaders of those countries, they do not know which policies enrich and enlighten the citizens. The same is the case with Sri Lanka so far. The another problem they have gone through is because of their managerial deficit, which Simkhada termed as the change management. And we accept your views. And because of all the internal conflicts, they all have brought Sri Lanka to these miserable and worst situations. So it's true, we really can learn many lessons from Sri Lankan cases. We have at the moment 2 schools of thought coming up among the politicians and the policymakers in Nepal. One school of thought, they argue that Nepal is not far from Sri Lanka to face such crisis. What Sri Lanka is suffering from. So Nepal is not far from that situation. The other school of thought, mostly from the politicians and the policy makers, from the governing elites of the present government, they think and they share their views that things are not going same as it is in Sri Lanka. Nepal's case is quite different. So we may not be facing such disastrous crises and worse situations, how in a way the Sri Lankan people and the country are suffering. So my questions to Dr. George Cook is, may we have some speculations, observations on that issue from your one perception? Thank you.
We can pick up one more question. I will go there and then come to you, Doctor. We can emphasize one point.
Thank you. I'm Suman. I also teach. So my question is to Dr. Simkhada. You pointed out two instances of decline in Nepal. One that you experienced yourself when you were driving on a car. Then that was decline of the panchayat, and then now that there is rising independent candidates. Now, where do you see the extent of social, political, and economic decline in Nepali society or in Nepali politics as we are drawing comparisons to Sri Lanka case? So, to the extent of social, political, and economic decline, can you shed some light on that?
Okay, thank you. We'll go for a quick round on this 3 questions. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you very much, Professor, for your question that you raised. What is the real issue when we go down to understanding what is going on in the country? As I mentioned in my remarks earlier, when we look at development, all of us want it. All of us want progress. We want it fast. Sri Lanka especially, after having gone through several decades of conflict, wanted this fast. We reached out to countries. How many came forward in terms of investing? Some did. Others chose not to, for whatever reasons. But one thing that we've got to be mindful, and I'll go back to Ambassador's point of national interest. A, B, C, D, E out there have their idea of investment, of what they can come and gain out of investing in a country like Sri Lanka. They would want to come in for the labor cost, they would want to come in due to the resources, they would want to come in due to the easing of financial regulations, they might come in for various reasons. Because they've got an idea of what they're going to get out of their investment. Now we, on the other hand, as recipients of that investment, which is going to be on our soil, in our country, going through our financial systems, impacting our economic system, impacting the livelihoods of our workers in our country, we've got to be mindful that whatever is coming into the country is coming in according to a national framework. You can't just put haphazard pieces together. You use the word haphazard. We can't put haphazard pieces together and make a complete picture. That's not going to happen. We need to know what that picture is. If you can contribute towards creating that picture, please come and do that. That is the message that we should have been sending out there for a long time. We've been expecting investment. Any investment, it's okay. Bring something, anything. No. You see, we've come to that point where the project has not been thought of in the long term. I'll give you an example. The Lotus Tower that we have in Colombo. As you come into the airport and you're driving to Colombo, you see that. Wow, it looks nice. It's standing out there. Now, there is a lot that should be done with that tower. It should not just be something you see when you come out of the airport. Just something you see. Have we strategized what we were going to do with it? How we were going to put it into operation? If those plans were there by that government that went out in January 2015, that government came back in 2019. Did you put that plan into operation? You see, unfortunately, in countries like ours, if I start a policy or I start a program and you come into power, you don't like it, you stop it. Then when I come back, I have revive it. I stop your programs. Nothing is Sri Lankan. It has your party label or my party label, which is the wrong thing. This is a very wrong thing that is happening. It should be good for Sri Lanka. There should be collective acknowledgement that this is going to be beneficial to the country before it is implemented, and there must be communication. Something I mentioned in the afternoon today as well, the port city. I have visited the port city, but who invited me to come and visit the port city? The Embassy of China. I accepted the invitation, I went to the port city and I asked a question. I thanked the representative who invited me and I said, thank you so much for inviting me, but I have a question. Why did you invite me? Shouldn't the Ports Authority of Sri Lanka invite me? He said, well, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to create awareness about it. So we're doing it. Who has failed here? We have failed. We should have been the one communicating. When it comes to Hambantota, when it comes to the industrial zone around it, we have got to make it productive. It is miles and miles away from the Chinese homeland, from the mainland. This is a port far away from China. If we want to make it prosper, we have to be stakeholders, we have to be partners, we have to make sure it's going to be productive. We have not done that. Those are some of the real issues where investment has been haphazard. Let me just cover that point. And Madam, the question that you asked in talking about recommendations, looking at things that countries like Nepal can gain out of these situations, where we can go, what we can actually be doing at this point. Investment on one hand, but also being mindful that we as countries are small. We are lower down the power ladder. We are countries which are in positions in which we need external support. If we try to isolate ourselves and say, we want you, we don't want you, we like you, we don't like you, we're going to land ourselves in trouble. We tend to take on others' disagreements, others' problems and make them our own. We tend to bring that into our equation. If two countries, if India and China have a problem, we feel, oh, we mustn't deal with China because India will get offended. We mustn't deal with India because China will get offended. Then who are you going to deal with? Because at the end of the day, China and India are dealing with each other. So you are trying to think and rethink and think a third time, and you are getting left behind. These countries are all working together. The Americans and the Chinese are working together. The Chinese and the Indians are working together. The Indians and the Americans are working together. Bring the Russians into the picture. They're all working together. We must not be going to second guess them and what they would think and what they would want to do. We've got to see what is in the best interest of our countries. Ambassador used the term national interest. We've got to keep going back to that. That has got to be the basic point. That has got to be the foundation upon which every decision is made. Because those countries are making decisions based on their national interest. China is a developing country. India is a developing country. But they are still going out there helping other countries. It's in their national interest to do that. They are growing in influence, they are growing in stature, they are growing in terms of image on the world stage. They've got an agenda, they've got a strategy, they're going about and achieving it. We don't need to get caught up in others' problems. Last week alone, we had the Russia-Ukraine issue being brought into Colombo, when an Aeroflot plane was grounded. Russia got highly offended. Why? This was something to do with the insurer coming out of Ireland, taking out a case in a magistrate's court in Sri Lanka, saying this insurance has lapsed, now we have to ground the plane. Now, our position, Russia got very offended. They stopped Aeroflot flights, they stopped the sale of tickets, they said they won't be flying to Colombo anymore. That was someone else's problem which they brought into Sri Lanka's garden. We don't need that. We were very clear, very categorical to the Russians, saying, no, this is a commercial issue, it has got nothing to do with the government, nothing to do with the programs, nothing to do with policy. Because Russia is a country that is working very closely in the United Nations Security Council with Sri Lanka. Russia and China, at the end of the day, have been towers of support. The other three have not. So there are various things that we've got to weigh, pros and cons on all sides, but all decisions have to be taken in the national interest of our own country. Maybe in 1967 we didn't join ASEAN, maybe Dudley Serenayake at that time thought it was in our national interest not to. I hope he did. I hope he did, and that was the reason for him to do that. But at the end of the day, one lesson that we draw out of this is country comes first. We must be very, very mindful of that point.
Thank you, George, again. Dr. Simkhara, you want to make a point or you want to pick up one more question?
I have only one issue that was addressed to me, and the simple answer is, you see, this institution called the nation state is a very critical, highest and most powerful institutional arrangement that human mind thought of in governance. There are attempts to transform it, like in Europe, on a regional basis. There was an attempt to transform it in the post-World War II era into a broader global governance process by introducing an idea of a collective security, prosperity, and dignity for all. None of them work, primarily because the world today faces an intellectual dilemma. All nation states' ultimate objective is to create a peaceful, prosperous, secure, and probably democratic societies, to create it and to maintain it and to govern it. That is the goal of the state. But what happens is, because of this idea that I introduced called the reverse sequencing of interest, today for a young man, the parent spends up to, a very recent example, during COVID, a relative of mine, his daughter was a medical doctor, and she had applied for a position in the US, but they had sort of delayed the visa, and so her admission to the US university was getting delayed. So she called me saying, if you know anybody, if you can help. So I tried to help through the foreign ministry and through the embassy, which they kindly did. But you know what I came to find out? In 1 year, there were 95 medical doctors leaving for the US in one lot. So out of those 95, how many will come back? The point is, when at the top of the leadership itself is distortion of this notion of national interest, then why should other people, as individuals or institutions, make national interest at the key of your policy making? So what happens is, you have a distortion of values, and that distortion of values creates problem in national interest. And that is what I'm trying to point out from the decline from the time earlier on to the present one. And the danger at the moment, and what Sri Lanka's case points out, is if a country like Sri Lanka with such sound foundations of other physical parameters of development can get to this stage, unless we are aware of this, in fact, we can get to that stage at no time, very rapidly, without even knowing it. So as a result, I don't think we are at that point yet in Nepal's case. And of course, one of the reasons why Sri Lanka has gotten to that situation is partly, we all know why, because we exist in a national but also an international world. And of course, international relation, the very definition of international relation is a study of major power relations and how they affect the world, including us. What do individual countries' foreign policy? They create, based on that understanding, you formulate your foreign policy so that you don't get to that kind of stage. So I think partly Sri Lanka, sort of in this global tussle, sort of could not comprehend the kind of situation they were getting into. And as a result, this acceleration of where they are is partly a result of that. So the point, final thing to Sumanji is that trajectory of decline is continuing, which is very sad. In fact, systemically, I think we are in a very much better kind of system. And yet when, there's a beautiful quote, in the absence of people to lead it well, a better system will not create a better society. And that is what we are facing at the moment. And unless we reverse the trend, the point I'm making is not just us, but there are many developing countries which are heading in the direction of Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yes, Dr. Vishnu Rajapreti. One more. So we'll go for these two questions, a set of questions, and then we'll, George or whoever is appointed will be.
Thank you. I am Vishnu Rajapreti, currently heading Policy Research Institute, government think tank. George, your perspective was quite interesting. Thank you for that. I have one specific question. Partly you touched the Chinese issue. I was more interested to hear what were the roles of Pakistan, China, USA and European Union, including Norway and others who were very active in the past during the conflict time, and what is their effect now and what is their response in that context. And just to complement to Shambhuram sir, this term I really like is outsourcing governance. Perfectly everywhere there are several examples, and only one I will cite is the policy project within the Ministry of Agriculture. So why we are in this situation in the agriculture sector? Precisely because such type of our policy have been developed by some donors having their own project inside the ministry and dealing everything by that. If you look to the health, how many donors have their office in the ministry and influencing? If we look to the water and others, so it was really outsourcing governance is the core of the problem. I realize since I am working in this policy issues. Thank you.
Yes. The last one.
Good evening to all. My name is Sudhir Shrestha. I teach economics in Tribhuvan University, Ratnadali campus. About the Sri Lankan crisis, I am curious to know about what is happening in Sri Lanka. One of my friends who did his Ph.D. from JNU, CSP, Prakash Singh, I asked him, "Oh, friends, please say about your Sri Lanka." He quickly gave me 10 points about the Sri Lankan, what is going on. On a point, I don't say all the points. One of the main points is the aid of policies adopted by Sri Lanka and regarding foreign policy, foreign reserve, and all the things. My question to George is that in Nepal, some of the experts say that Sri Lanka's present crisis is facing because Sri Lanka didn't accept the MCC and the World Bank policies, ADB policies. And now the government presently regulated the policy makers who are following the ADB and World Bank policies so that things will be managed now. My question to George is, what is the role of economic policy that Sri Lanka adopted since 1981? If there is any things behind this crisis, except the policies resolving the ethnic crisis?
Just one sentence. My name is Dr. Savitri Thapaguru. I have one question to George. Since almost all Nepalese are very much afraid of Sri Lankan crisis, although Dr. Simkhada said we have not that kind of situation. But I want to know from you that what major lesson can we learn from Sri Lankan crisis in our situation, in our Nepalese situation? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try to give as comprehensive and brief as answers as possible. So the first question that was asked was, what are other countries doing? Where is the European Union? Where are countries in the neighborhood? What are they doing? Italy provided humanitarian support. Indonesia provided support. Japan has given a very limited amount of support. Much more is expected. Why isn't it coming? Why is this assistance not coming? There are several factors that are being considered for that. The president is still in office. He is determined to stay in office. In an interview that he gave an international media organization last week, he said, "I can't go as a failed president. If he waits there for 2 more years, we will have no country for him to preside over." That is something he doesn't realize. Whether he goes now or whether he goes in 2 years or goes in 2 months, he has failed. He has got to accept that, something that he doesn't want to do. He surrounded himself with the wrong people. They gave him the wrong advice. They misled him. He's now realizing that. He's trying to correct it. But the damage has been done. Certain countries are hesitant to come on board and support. Because we've also got to understand there are other issues happening in other countries, in other parts of the world. Sri Lanka is not the center of the universe. Everybody is not waiting to write a check to Sri Lanka and say, how can we support Sri Lanka and how can we revive your economy? There are other economic, financial, political, military conflicts elsewhere in the world, which countries are trying to deal with. So, why hasn't that assistance come on board? One school of thought is the president is still in office. You're just going to keep pouring in money, which is going to be wasted at that point. But another point that we need to understand is that certain countries out there which are in a capacity to support, let's take countries in West Asia. These are very prosperous countries which are doing extremely well when it comes to oil and gas, you name it. The current president adopted some very wrong policies when he came into power, which marginalized a certain community in the country, which was the Muslim community. Now reaching out to those countries again, you've got to have a very thick skin to do that in order to ask those countries for assistance now, after some of the policies that were brought in. So there are inherent issues there, which we have not been able to address yet. When I say us, I mean the government has not been able to address in that case, and as a result, assistance that would have been expected is not exactly forthcoming. It's not coming in the same way it is expected. India is going all out to support, as I mentioned, because India will be the first to be affected if the country sinks even further. They don't want that to happen. Pakistan is also going through various political changes within the country. The Prime Minister stepped down, new Prime Minister, new changes, political instability in the country, and there are things they're trying to sort out there. Bangladesh has supported. Bangladesh has come forward and provided medical assistance. Bangladesh has given us credit lines. Bangladesh was created in 1971. Bangladesh has done a lot to support Sri Lanka, even extending the repayment timeline so that we have more time. But Bangladesh can't keep giving and giving either. Bangladesh has their own issues to deal with. So yes, a lot more assistance can come, especially countries in East Asia, Japan, Korea. Korea is providing more job opportunities, which is a long-term form of assistance, long-term solution there. So hopefully these things will come on board. To go to that point of raising the issue of is the MCC to blame or not taking the MCC to blame, that was $480 million. It is a lot of money which Sri Lanka turned its nose up against. We had asked for the MCC, and when it was granted, we said no. And that's because there were people in the government at the time who were instrumental in creating this understanding that anything American is bad. Anything that has an American flag on it or is going to America is bad. So unfortunately, they didn't weigh the pros and cons of what those projects are, what those programs are. They felt that one of the projects was to do with the land registry, assessing the land in the country. Because there's a lot of state land that is there are squatters, there are people who have occupied state land, to do a proper assessment of it. Now, when you want to do that, you need lots of resources in the country to do that. Sri Lanka doesn't have the resources to devote for such a project. Why is America interested in coming and doing a land assessment in Sri Lanka? America is looking at food security in the future. They are looking at arable land, they're looking at fertile soil, where you can grow crops, what you can do, what projects you can implement. So we said no. The second one was to do with satellites and the movement of traffic and trying to move higher up in terms of development in the long term. People were then concerned, oh, satellites over the country, they're going to know what's happening. Without our knowledge, they know what is happening. They don't need our permission to set up satellites over the country. We don't have a way of tracking them. We don't know what they're doing. So, is the MCC to blame for the situation we are in, or not taking the MCC? No. Not going to the IMF earlier? Yes. We should have gone to the IMF much earlier, because the IMF is not a program in which you can go and have a meeting in Washington today and you leave at the end of the day with a check in your hand. That doesn't happen. The IMF has a rigorous process that you have to abide by, because the IMF wants the money that they give returned to them. They're going bankrupt otherwise if they don't recover the money that they are loaning out. So that is another issue there. We did not go to the IMF on time. We did not seek alternate sources of assistance either. We did not look at restructuring our debt earlier. Now we are looking at the appointment of international financial experts and legal experts to restructure debt. Now we are expecting countries to say, okay, Sri Lanka, we will either forgive the debt or in the long term you can delay your payment. And today, I remember a question was asked from me saying, why isn't China delaying the repayment? Because China has said, you have to pay a loan, right? Okay, we'll give you another loan to repay that loan. Right? So that's what China can do. Why isn't China delaying the payment process? Because all of the countries will say, you gave it to Sri Lanka, right? Can you give it to us also? That's going to affect China's long-term objectives and goals and where they want to get to. So we've always got to put ourselves in others' shoes and look at how they are viewing the situation. Even when it comes to assistance coming to the country, others are grappling with their own issues. That's something we've got to be very mindful of. Going back to the question of a major lesson that we can take out of the Sri Lankan crisis, when Ambassador was mentioning 95 doctors going out of Nepal into America, it reminded me of a certain bit of statistics coming out of Sri Lanka. Last year, in 2021, the Department of Immigration and Immigration issued 85,000 passports for a year. For the whole year, 85,000 passports. This year, we are now at the beginning of June. In January, the department issued 50,000 passports. In February, 50,000 passports. In March, 50,000. April, 50,000. made 50,000 passports. There are queues which are stretching up to kilometers outside the passport office to get passports and leave. I know people who have left. I know someone who went to Dubai. I said, do you have a job there? Oh no, you can find jobs. It's very easy. Dubai is doing very well. Expo is going on. Lots of things we can do. He got a 3-month visa. He went there. Now the visa is coming to an end. At the end of this month, 3 months are over. Now he's coming back because he couldn't get a job. So people are busting the money that they have remaining also in looking for things outside. But there's a massive brain drain. And the impact of that will not be felt today. It will not be felt this year. That will be felt in the years ahead. During the times of the past, with that Sinhala-only policy, we had a mass exodus of people. With the conflict, we had another mass exodus of people. We are having another exodus of people once again. Once they go, they don't come back. They will support their families, they'll come back on holiday, but they're going because they're concerned about their children. They're concerned about education for their children. What kind of prospects will their children have in the future? People are thinking of the next generation. That is something we have to be very, very mindful of, because those are long-term impacts. Next year, we might be able to recover to some extent economically. Financially, we might be able to get a massive infusion. Japan is apparently toying with the idea of supporting Sri Lanka that much more. Other countries can be reached out to. India will continue to support. China will come on board. But okay, we'll get through the economic side of it. The hardships will have to be endured for some time, but we'll get through that. The overall social changes that are taking place, the brain drain that is taking place, that's going to affect the country for decades to come. Recovering from that is not easy.
Thank you, both presenters, especially for your comprehensive presentations, and thanks to George, especially when drawing the lessons from Sri Lankan crisis. And what we see that is the first thing first is after Bretton Woods institutions or the Second World War, this is the first country in Asia Pacific which has faced this much crisis. I mean, the biggest the first thing we have seen. I mean, many countries who survived even after a war, Vietnam, Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and many. But this crisis is unique, which is a sovereign default. One. The second thing what I want to mention, for us, all of us in the Eastern societies, the term nation state is something that has been completely new for us, because we were already states, we were already new, the societies were in a different form, and the Westerners or the Western discourse has set the nation state discourse, which is not very close to our societies. This is a state nation discourse should be reversed in this dimension for the social science and the political scientist. Second thing what I want to mention, and the third thing is what the Claire Brown, American economist, is talking about, the Buddhist economics. The economics with the peace, where the equality is must, and the sustainability with the climate change issues, it must be looked after. Because the policies where we are framing is not only that, as Dr. Priti is saying, that all the ministries are occupied by the policymakers are all from outside. And they are not closely looking, as George was mentioning about, who are piling the money for what purposes. So we know only after a few years or the decades what were the consequences. So with these points, what I think is it's again brainchild of the NICE, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, BIMSTEC dialogue series, the first one, and we got this opportunity. Thank you, George, and thank you, NICE, and I hope you enlightened us about the crisis, about the the challenges, and pointed some lessons for us also, because we are also in difficult position, but only we can extend our solidarity and our good wishes that you should come out from the crisis. All the Nepalese people, from our side, I want to extend our, the strength we are with you in the phase of this crisis. So with this, I want to hand over.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Here we come to the end of the discussion. It has been such an honor to be the part of this wonderful event. I, on behalf of NICE, would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest and chair, Dr. Deepak Prakash Bhatt, Dr. Shambhuram Singh Khada, and George Cook for the insightful presentation and remarks. We are truly honored. A big round of applause and thanks also goes to all the participants who made the event a memorable one. We are also thankful to our director, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, and the other staff, especially Nisha, for all the supports in organizing this event. Thank you once again. Please join us for a group photo and the dinner. Thank you.